The smell of whiskey and desperation hung thick in the air of Porter's saloon when Natalie Richmond watched her father shake hands with a stranger over a bottle of rotgut and $20 cash. She was 21 years old, standing in a torn calico dress behind the bar where she had been cleaning glasses, and in that single moment, she realized her father had just sold her like a piece of livestock to settle his gambling debts. "It's done then," her father Frank Richmond said, his words slurred and his eyes unable to meet hers. "She'll work for you, do whatever you need. We got an agreement." The stranger was a rail-thin man named Silas Crane, with yellowed teeth and hands that shook from too much drinking and too little honest work. He ran a brothel 2 towns over, and Natalie had heard stories about the girls who disappeared into that place, never to be seen again. Her stomach turned to ice. "Papa, no," she whispered, but Frank Richmond had already turned his back, clutching the bottle like it was worth more than his only daughter. Silas Crane reached for her arm with fingers that felt like cold worms against her skin. "Come on now, girl. We got a long ride ahead." But before his grip could tighten, another hand caught his wrist. The hand belonged to a tall cowboy who had been sitting in the corner, nursing a single beer for the past hour. Natalie had noticed him earlier because he was cleaner than most men who came through Tulsa, Oklahoma in the summer of 1881, and because his eyes were a startling shade of gray that seemed to take in everything without judgment. "I don't think so," the cowboy said quietly. His voice was deep and steady, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to command attention. Silas Crane jerked his hand back and turned to face the interloper. "This ain't your business, stranger. I got a legal agreement with her father." The cowboy stood up slowly, revealing his full height, which was considerable. He wore a dusty brown hat, a leather vest over a white shirt, and a gun belt that sat low on his hips. Everything about him suggested a man who knew how to handle himself but preferred not to unless necessary. "Show me this agreement," the cowboy said. Silas fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper where Frank Richmond had scrawled his name and Natalie's. It was barely legible, written in a drunken hand, but it was there nonetheless. The cowboy took the paper, studied it for a moment, then tore it cleanly in half. "That's what I think of your agreement," he said, dropping the pieces on the floor. Silas's face went purple with rage. "You got no right. I paid good money." The cowboy reached into his own pocket and pulled out $20, placing it on the table along with an unopened bottle of whiskey he grabbed from behind the bar. "There's your money and your bottle. The deal is off." "Now wait just a minute." Frank Richmond stumbled forward, suddenly interested now that money was on the table. "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Gideon Stone," the cowboy said. "And I'm someone who doesn't stand by while a man sells his daughter like she's a horse." Frank's face flushed with shame and anger. "She's my daughter. I'll do what I please." "Not anymore," Gideon said. He turned to Natalie and his expression softened. "Miss, do you want to go with this man?" Natalie looked at Silas Crane's greedy eyes, then at her father's drunken face, and finally at this stranger who had just torn up a contract without asking for anything in return. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I don't." "Then you won't," Gideon said simply. He offered her his arm. "Come on. Let's get you out of here." Silas made a move for his gun, but Gideon was faster. His hand dropped to his holster in a blur, and suddenly his revolver was pointed straight at Silas's chest. "Don't," Gideon said quietly. "Just take your money and your bottle and leave." The saloon had gone completely silent. Every eye was on them. Silas Crane looked around, saw no allies in this room, and evidently decided that $20 and a bottle were better than a bullet. He grabbed the money and the whiskey and backed toward the door. "This ain't over," he spat, but everyone knew it was. Frank Richmond reached for Natalie's other arm. "You can't just take her. She's all I got." "Then you should have treated her better," Gideon said coldly. He looked at Frank with something like pity. A man who'd sell his own daughter for whiskey doesn't deserve to have a daughter at all. Natalie pulled her arm free from her father's weak grasp. She had spent the last 5 years caring for him after her mother died of fever, cooking and cleaning and working at the saloon to keep them fed. She had watched him drink away every cent she earned, had endured his bitter complaints and his increasing desperation. She had stayed because he was her father, and because she had nowhere else to go. But something in her broke when he shook hands with Silas Crane, and she knew she could not stay any longer. "Goodbye, Papa," she said softly, and walked out of Porter's saloon with her hand resting lightly on Gideon Stone's arm. Outside, the Oklahoma sun blazed down on the dusty street. Tulsa was a railroad town, not large but growing, with false-fronted buildings and wooden sidewalks and the constant noise of cattle being driven to the stockyards. Natalie had lived here her entire life and had never once left. Gideon's horse was tied up at the hitching post, a handsome buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes. "Can you ride?" Gideon asked. "Yes," Natalie said, though she had not been on a horse in years. "Good." Gideon untied the horse and swung into the saddle with easy grace. He offered his hand to help her up behind him. Natalie hesitated for just a moment, then took his hand and let him pull her up. She settled behind the saddle, her arms awkwardly hovering at her sides. "You'll want to hold on," Gideon said. "It's a ways to my place." Natalie wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. The horse started moving at a steady walk down the main street, and Natalie realized she had just left behind everything she knew with a complete stranger. It should have terrified her, but instead she felt something like relief. They rode in silence through Tulsa and out onto the open prairie. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, covered in yellowing grass and dotted with scrub oak. The heat was intense, the kind of dry heat that sucked the moisture from your skin, but there was a breeze that made it bearable. Natalie watched the town shrink behind them and wondered if she would ever see it again. After about an hour, Gideon spoke. "I should explain myself." "You don't have to," Natalie said. "I think I do," Gideon replied. "I don't make a habit of interfering in other people's business, but what your father did back there crossed a line. No woman should be traded like property." "Thank you," Natalie said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Gideon said firmly. "I have a sister back in Texas. She's about your age. If someone had tried to do that to her and nobody stood up, I'd never forgive myself. So when I see something like that, I can't just sit there." "Where are we going?" Natalie asked, realizing she had not thought to ask before. "My ranch," Gideon said. "It's about 20 miles west of Tulsa. Not much to look at yet, but it's mine. Got a small house, a barn, some cattle. I've been building it up for the past 3 years. And what do you expect from me?" Natalie asked, needing to know what she had traded one bad situation for. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Nothing you're not willing to give," he said finally. "You can stay in the house. I'll sleep in the barn. You can help with cooking and such if you want, but mainly you'll just be safe. When you figure out what you want to do next, we'll work that out." "Just like that," Natalie said skeptically. "You expect nothing in return." "I expect you to be honest with me and work hard if you stay," Gideon said. "But I'm not going to force you into anything. You've had enough of that." Natalie did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They rode on through the afternoon, the sun moving slowly across the bright blue sky. Gideon pointed out landmarks along the way. A creek where you could always find water, a grove of trees where he had once sheltered from a tornado, the boundary markers of various ranches. He talked in a low, steady voice that was oddly soothing, and Natalie found herself relaxing against his back. The ranch appeared as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. It was modest, as Gideon had said. A small wooden house with a front porch, a barn that looked newly built, a corral with a few horses, and beyond that, cattle grazing on the prairie. But it was neat and well-maintained, and there was something hopeful about it. Gideon dismounted and helped Natalie down. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the house." The house was simple but clean. One main room with a kitchen area, a table and chairs, and a fireplace. A door led to a small bedroom with a bed covered in a patchwork quilt. "You'll take the bedroom," Gideon said. "I mean it about sleeping in the barn." "This is your home," Natalie protested. "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will," Gideon said firmly. "I won't hear any arguments about it." Natalie looked around the bedroom, at the bed that looked more comfortable than anything she had slept on in years, at the window with real glass and curtains. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "You don't know me." Gideon met her eyes, and she saw nothing but sincerity in his gray gaze. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because nobody should have to go through what you almost went through today." Natalie felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had let herself feel since her father made that terrible handshake. She blinked them back. "Thank you," she whispered. Gideon nodded and stepped back. "There's a well out back for water. I'll bring in some firewood and get supper started." "You just rest." He left her alone in the bedroom, and Natalie sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw and felt like heaven. She lay back and stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. This morning she had been trapped in her father's spiral of debt and desperation. Now she was in a stranger's house, 20 miles from everything she knew, with no idea what came next. But she was safe. That was something. Natalie must have dozed off because she woke to the smell of cooking meat. She rose and smoothed her dress as best she could, then went out to the main room. Gideon was at the stove, frying up some salt pork and beans. He had removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that was slightly too long. In the lamplight, his face was lean and weathered, with lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. He was handsome in a quiet, unassuming way. "Hope you're hungry," he said when he noticed her. "It's not fancy, but it'll fill you up." They ate at the small table, and Natalie realized she was starving. She could not remember the last time she had eaten a full meal. Gideon ate methodically, not talking much, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. "Tell me about yourself," Natalie said finally, wanting to know more about this man who had upended her life. Gideon set down his fork and considered. "Not much to tell. I grew up in Texas on a ranch near San Antonio. My father raised cattle and I learned the trade from him. When he died 4 years ago, my older brother took over the ranch. He offered me a job, but I wanted to build something of my own. So I came up here to Oklahoma, filed a claim, and started building." "Do you have other family besides your brother and sister?" "My mother's still alive, and I have 2 younger brothers as well. They all stayed in Texas. I write them letters when I can, but it's been a while since I've seen them." "Do you get lonely out here?" Natalie asked. Gideon smiled slightly. "Sometimes. But I like the work, and I like the independence. I've got neighbors within riding distance if I need help, and I go into Tulsa every few weeks for supplies." "Is that why you were there today?" "Yes. I was buying some tools and decided to stop for a drink before heading back." He looked at her seriously. "I'm glad I did." Natalie felt her cheeks warm. "So am I," she admitted. After supper, Gideon insisted on cleaning up while Natalie rested. She sat on the porch and watched the sun finish setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The prairie was beautiful in its vastness, and the air was finally cooling. She could hear cattle lowing in the distance and the chirp of crickets beginning their evening song. Gideon joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one and sat down on the steps, stretching out his long legs. "It's peaceful, isn't it?" he said. "Very," Natalie agreed. She sipped the coffee, which was strong and bitter but warming. "I've never been anywhere this quiet." "You'll get used to it," Gideon said. "Or you won't, and you'll want to go back to town eventually. Either way is fine." "I don't think I want to go back," Natalie said softly. "There's nothing for me there." Gideon did not respond, just nodded and drank his coffee. They sat in companionable silence as the stars began to emerge, thousands of them scattered across the darkening sky. Natalie had never seen so many stars. "I should let you rest," Gideon said eventually. He stood and collected their empty cups. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." "Just holler." "Good night," Natalie said. "And thank you again." "Good night, Miss Richmond," Gideon replied and walked off toward the barn. Natalie went inside and locked the door, though she was not sure why. She trusted Gideon to keep his word. In the bedroom, she discovered a wash basin with clean water and a bar of soap. She washed her face and hands, relishing the feeling of being clean. Then she removed her worn dress and lay down on the bed in her shift. The sheets smelled like sunshine and fresh air. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Natalie felt safe enough to truly sleep. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of a rooster crowing. She dressed quickly and went out to find Gideon already up and working. He was in the corral, training a young horse. He moved with the animal with patience and confidence, speaking to it in a low, calm voice. Natalie watched for a few minutes, then went inside to start breakfast. She found eggs in a basket, along with some bread and butter. By the time Gideon came in, she had prepared a simple meal. "You didn't have to do that," Gideon said, but he looked pleased. "I wanted to," Natalie said. "I need to feel useful." They fell into a routine over the next few days. Gideon worked the ranch, tending to his cattle and horses, repairing fences, and doing the 100 other tasks that came with running a place. Natalie took over the cooking and cleaning, and discovered a vegetable garden behind the house that had been somewhat neglected. She weeded and watered it, coaxing the plants back to life. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk. Natalie learned that Gideon was 26 years old, that he loved his work but missed his family, that he had fought in a few gunfights but preferred to avoid violence when possible. He had dreams of expanding his ranch, of building something that would last. Gideon, in turn, learned about Natalie's life. She told him about her mother, who had been kind and gentle and died too young. She told him about her father's slow descent into alcoholism after his wife's death, how he had lost his job and his pride and finally his humanity. She told him about the years of struggling to keep them afloat, of the exhaustion and the fear. "I kept thinking he would get better," Natalie said one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "I kept thinking if I just worked hard enough, if I just loved him enough, he would stop drinking and be my father again. But he just got worse." "It's not your fault," Gideon said gently. "What he did, that was his choice. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." "I know," Natalie said, wiping at her eyes, "but it still hurts." "Of course it does," Gideon said. "He's your father, but you're free now. You can build your own life." Natalie looked at him, at this good man who had saved her without asking for anything in return. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted. "We'll figure it out together," Gideon said, and the wee warmed her more than the coffee ever could. As the weeks passed, Natalie began to feel like the ranch was her home. She learned to milk the cow, to gather eggs, to bake bread in the cast-iron oven. She mended Gideon's clothes and made new curtains for the windows. The vegetable garden flourished under her care, producing tomatoes and beans and squash. Gideon still slept in the barn, though Natalie had offered several times to switch. He refused every time, saying it was not proper for them to share the house at night when they were not married. The word hung between them, unspoken but present, because something was growing between them, something neither of them had planned. It started small, a lingering glance, a brush of hands when passing a plate, a laugh that lasted too long. Natalie found herself watching for Gideon to come in from the fields, found herself caring more about how she looked, found herself wanting to be near him. And Gideon, she realized, felt the same. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her heart race. He found excuses to be near her, to help her with tasks she could easily do alone. He smiled more when she was around, and his gray eyes softened whenever they looked at her, but neither of them said anything. It was too new, too fragile. And Natalie was still healing from what her father had done, still learning to trust again. One afternoon in late August, nearly a month after Natalie had arrived, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was a rough-looking man with a scar across his cheek, and Natalie recognized him immediately. He had been one of the men at Porter's Saloon the day her father sold her. Her stomach clenched with fear. Gideon came out of the barn, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Can I help you?" he asked. The stranger looked around the ranch, his eyes settling on Natalie, who stood frozen on the porch. "I'm looking for a girl," he said. "Natalie Richmond. Her father said she ran off with a cowboy named Stone." "What do you want with her?" Gideon asked, his voice hard. "Her father's dead," the stranger said bluntly. "Drank himself to death about 2 weeks back. He owed money all over town, and the creditors are looking to collect. Figured they might be able to get something from his daughter." Natalie felt the world tilt. Her father was dead. She had known it would happen eventually, but hearing it said out loud made it real. She gripped the porch railing to steady herself. Gideon noticed, and his expression darkened. "His daughter doesn't owe anyone anything," he said firmly. "Her father's debts died with him." "That's not how some folks see it," the stranger said. "I'm just delivering a message. There are men who'll come looking. Then they'll find me," Gideon said coldly. "And I'll tell them the same thing I'm telling you. Now get off my land." The stranger shrugged and turned his horse. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he called over his shoulder and rode away. Gideon immediately went to Natalie, who had sunk down onto the porch step. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking. "Are you all right?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "He's dead," Natalie whispered. "My father is dead." "I'm sorry," Gideon said softly, taking her hand. Natalie looked at him with eyes full of complicated grief. "I should feel sadder," she said. "He was my father, but all I feel is tired." "That's all right," Gideon said. "You're allowed to feel however you feel." "What if they come for me?" Natalie asked, fear creeping into her voice. "What if they try to force me to pay his debts?" "They won't," Gideon said firmly. "I won't let them. You're under my protection now." "But you heard what he said. They'll come here." "Let them," Gideon said. His jaw was set in a determined line. "This is my land and you're my guest. Anyone who tries to take you will have to go through me first." Natalie felt tears spill over. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care so much?" Gideon cupped her face gently, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "Because you matter," he said quietly. "Because you deserve to be safe and happy. And because I care about you, Natalie. More than I should, probably, but I can't help it." Natalie's breath caught. "Gideon," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Gideon said quickly. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still dealing with everything, but I needed you to know." You're not alone in this. Natalie looked into his gray eyes and saw only honesty and affection, and she realized that what she felt for him was more than gratitude, more than friendship. Somewhere in the past month, she had fallen in love with this quiet, honorable man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. "It's not too soon," she said softly. "I care about you too, Gideon. I think I have for a while now." Gideon's expression transformed, hope lighting his face. "Really?" he asked, as if he could not quite believe it. "Really," Natalie confirmed, and then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet. Gideon made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, one hand cradling the back of her head. Natalie melted into him, feeling safe and wanted and cherished. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Gideon admitted, resting his forehead against hers. "Me too," Natalie said, smiling through her tears. They sat together on the porch, Natalie leaning against Gideon's solid warmth, and watched the sun move across the sky. The grief over her father's death was still there, but it was manageable now. She had Gideon, and she had this place, and she had a future. "What do we do now?" Natalie asked eventually. "We keep living," Gideon said. "We build a life together if that's what you want." "I do want that," Natalie said. "More than anything." "Then we will," Gideon said, kissing the top of her head. "But first, we deal with anyone who comes looking for you, together." As it turned out, they did not have to wait long. 3 days later, 2 men rode up to the ranch. They were creditors from Tulsa, and they were not friendly. "We're here for Natalie Richmond," the first man said. He was heavy-set with mean eyes. "Her father owed us money, and we aim to collect." "How much?" Gideon asked calmly. He stood in front of the house with Natalie beside him, his hand resting on his gun. $70, the second man said. He was thinner but no less threatening, plus interest. "And you think you can collect from his daughter?" Gideon asked. "She's his kin. She's responsible for his debts." "That's not how the law works," Gideon said. "Unless she signed something saying she'd pay, she owes you nothing." "We don't need the law," the heavy man said. "We got our own way of doing things." "Not on my land, you don't," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "You're going to turn around and leave, and you're not going to come back." The thin man sneered. "And who's going to make us?" "You, if I have to," Gideon said evenly. "But I'd rather not. So I'm going to make you an offer. I'll pay you $50 right now, and you forget about the rest. That's more than fair considering you're not legally owed anything." The 2 men looked at each other. $50 was a lot of money. Finally, the heavy man nodded. "All right. $50 and we're done." Gideon went into the house and returned with the money. He counted it out carefully, making sure both men saw. "This settles Frank Richmond's debt," he said. "You got that?" "We got it," the thin man said, taking the money. "But understand something. You just bought her. That makes her yours now." "No," Gideon said sharply. "I paid off a debt that wasn't hers to begin with. She's not property. She's a free woman who chooses to be here. Get that through your heads." The men shrugged and rode off, apparently satisfied. Natalie waited until they were out of sight before turning to Gideon. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "That was $50 you worked hard for." "It was worth it to get them off your back," Gideon said. "Now it's done. You're free, Natalie, truly free." Natalie felt the weight she had been carrying finally lift. Her father's debts were paid. No one had any claim on her. She could start fresh. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "For everything. For saving me, for protecting me, for caring about me." "You don't have to thank me," Gideon said, pulling her into his arms. "I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." They held each other on the porch as the sun climbed higher, and Natalie knew with absolute certainty that she was home. That evening, as they sat together after supper, Gideon took Natalie's hand. "I want to ask you something," he said, sounding nervous. "What is it?" Natalie asked. "I know it hasn't been that long since you came here," Gideon said, "and I know you've been through a lot. But I can't imagine my life without you anymore. You've made this house a home. You've made me happier than I've been in years. And I love you, Natalie. I love you so much it scares me sometimes." Natalie's heart was pounding. "I love you too," she said softly. "Then marry me," Gideon said, his gray eyes intense. "Be my wife. Let's build this life together properly. I'll be good to you, I swear. I'll work hard and provide for you and never give you reason to regret it." Natalie felt tears of joy spill down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I'll marry you." Gideon let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around. They were both laughing now, giddy with happiness. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, pouring all his love and hope into it. "We'll go into Tulsa tomorrow," Gideon said when they finally came up for air. "We'll find a preacher and do it right. I want you to be my wife as soon as possible." "Tomorrow sounds perfect," Natalie agreed. That night, Gideon still slept in the barn, but it was the last time. The next day they rode into Tulsa together, and Natalie was not afraid. She had Gideon beside her, and she had a future ahead of her. The preacher was an elderly man named Reverend Walsh, who had known Natalie's mother. He was pleased to perform the ceremony, though he was surprised by the quick courtship. "Are you sure about this child?" he asked Natalie privately. "It's only been a few weeks." "I'm sure," Natalie said firmly. "Gideon is a good man. He saved my life, and I love him." Reverend Walsh studied her, then nodded. "I can see you mean it, and Lord knows you deserve some happiness after what you've been through. Very well. I'll marry you." They held the ceremony that afternoon in the small church at the edge of town. There were no guests, just the three of them and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Natalie wore the same calico dress she had arrived in, but Gideon looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Do you, Gideon Stone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Walsh asked. "I do," Gideon said clearly, his eyes never leaving Natalie's face. "And do you, Natalie Richmond, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Natalie said, her voice strong and sure. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Gideon cupped Natalie's face and kissed her gently, reverently. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling so wide it hurt. They signed the marriage certificate, paid Reverend Walsh, and rode back to the ranch as husband and wife. The sun was setting as they arrived, painting everything in gold light. Gideon helped Natalie down from the horse and did not let go, instead lifting her into his arms. "What are you doing?" Natalie asked, laughing. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Gideon said, grinning. "It's tradition." He carried her into the house and set her down gently in the main room. The lamp was lit, casting warm light over the simple furniture. It was not grand, but it was theirs. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone," Gideon said softly. "I like the sound of that," Natalie said, wrapping her arms around his neck. They kissed again, longer this time, with the promise of the night ahead. When Gideon picked her up again and carried her to the bedroom, Natalie went willingly, her heart full of love and trust. That night they became husband and wife in truth, learning each other with tenderness and passion. Gideon was gentle with her, patient and caring, making sure she felt loved and cherished. Natalie gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. In the darkness of their bedroom, they created something beautiful together. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Natalie's head resting on Gideon's chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, and feel his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her back. "Happy," Gideon murmured. "So happy," Natalie said. "I never thought I could be this happy." "Me neither," Gideon admitted. When I walked into Porter's saloon that day, I never imagined I'd find you. It feels like fate." "Maybe it was," Natalie said. She propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. "Thank you for tearing up that deal. Thank you for taking me home." "Thank you for saying yes," Gideon said, pulling her down for another kiss. "To all of it." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time in her life, Natalie dreamed of a future full of hope. The weeks turned into months, and Natalie settled fully into her new life. She took to being a rancher's wife with surprising ease, learning the rhythms of the land and the work. She helped Gideon with the cattle when he needed an extra hand, cooked hearty meals to fuel their long days, and made the small house feel like a real home. Gideon was everything a husband should be: hardworking, affectionate, and devoted. He never raised his voice to her, never made her feel small or afraid. He consulted her on decisions about the ranch, valuing her opinion. He brought her small gifts from town: a new dress, a book, a packet of flower seeds for her garden. And every night he held her close and told her he loved her. In October, Natalie began to suspect she was pregnant. She waited a few more weeks to be sure before telling Gideon. One evening after supper, as they sat on the porch watching the autumn sunset, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I think we're going to have a baby," she said softly. Gideon's eyes went wide. "Really? Are you sure?" "Pretty sure," Natalie said, smiling at his expression. "It's early yet, but all the signs are there." Gideon let out a shout of pure joy and pulled her into his arms, kissing her all over her face. "A baby? We're going to have a baby," Natalie laughed, delighted by his enthusiasm. "I guess you're happy about this." "Happy? I'm over the moon," Gideon said. He pulled back and looked at her seriously. "How are you feeling? Are you all right? Do you need anything?" "I'm fine," Natalie assured him. "A little tired, but fine." "You need to rest more," Gideon said immediately. "No more heavy lifting. I'll take care of everything." "Gideon, I'm pregnant, not sick," Natalie said, amused. "I can still work." "But you shouldn't have to," Gideon insisted. "You're carrying our child. That's the most important job there is." They compromised. Natalie would continue with her normal tasks but would stop if she felt tired or unwell. Gideon hovered for the first few weeks, constantly checking on her, until Natalie had to gently tell him to give her some space. He apologized sheepishly and tried to be less obvious about his worry. As Natalie's pregnancy progressed, Gideon built a cradle from smooth pine wood, sanding it until it was perfect. Natalie sewed baby clothes from soft fabric she bought in Tulsa, embroidering little flowers and animals on them. They talked endlessly about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the future. "I want our children to know they're loved," Natalie said one evening, her hand resting on her growing belly. "I want them to feel safe and valued." "They will," Gideon promised. "We'll make sure of it." In late December, with snow beginning to dust the prairie, their neighbors stopped by to check on them. The nearest ranch was owned by a couple named Tom and Sarah Miller, who had been ranching in Oklahoma for 10 years. They were friendly and practical people, and they took Natalie under their wing. "You'll want a midwife when your time comes," Sarah said, drinking coffee at Natalie's kitchen table. "I can help if you need me. I've delivered 6 babies, including 4 of my own." "I'd appreciate that," Natalie said gratefully. "I don't know much about childbirth." "Most first-time mothers don't," Sarah said kindly. "But you'll do fine. You're strong." Over the winter months, Sarah visited regularly, teaching Natalie what to expect and how to prepare. Gideon split extra firewood to make sure they would be warm when the baby came. He stocked up on supplies, bought a cow so they would have fresh milk, and did everything he could think of to make things easier. The baby came in late April, on a warm spring day when the prairie was covered in wildflowers. Natalie's labor started in the early morning, and Gideon immediately rode to fetch Sarah. The hours that followed were long and difficult, but Sarah was a calm and experienced presence, guiding Natalie through the pain. Gideon paced outside, unable to sit still, starting at every sound from inside the house. Tom Miller had come along to keep him company, and he tried to reassure the anxious father-to-be. "Sarah's delivered dozens of babies," Tom said. "Your wife is in good hands." "I know," Gideon said, running his hands through his hair. "But that doesn't make it easier to hear her in pain." "That's part of being a husband," Tom said. "The hardest part, maybe, but it'll be worth it." Finally, as the sun began to set, a baby's cry rang out from inside the house. Gideon froze, his heart pounding. A few minutes later, Sarah appeared in the doorway, smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A healthy, strong boy, and your wife did wonderfully." Gideon did not wait to hear more. He rushed inside to find Natalie propped up in bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit up. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Gideon approached slowly, almost afraid. He looked down at the baby and felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it took his breath away. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small, snuffling sounds. His tiny fist waved in the air. "He's perfect," Gideon whispered. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch his son's soft cheek. "You're perfect. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for giving me this." "We made him together," Natalie said, smiling through her tears. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names extensively over the past months. "What about Henry?" Gideon suggested. "After your mother's father." Natalie's eyes filled with fresh tears. Her grandfather Henry had been a kind man who died when she was young, but she had loved him dearly. "Henry Stone," she said. "I love it." "Henry Stone it is," Gideon said. He carefully took his son from Natalie's arms, cradling him awkwardly but tenderly. Henry opened his eyes, which were a deep blue, and seemed to study his father's face. "Hello, Henry. I'm your papa. And I promise you, I'm going to be the best father I can be. You're going to grow up knowing you're loved and wanted. You'll never doubt that." Natalie watched her husband holding their son and felt such overwhelming love she thought she might burst from it. This was her family. These two were her whole world. Sarah came back in with a tray of food. "You need to eat and rest," she told Natalie. "And you," she said to Gideon, "need to let your wife sleep. You can hold that baby all night if you want, but do it in the other room." Gideon nodded, though he was reluctant to leave Natalie. "I'll be right outside if you need me," he told her. "I know," Natalie said. "Thank you for everything." That night, while Natalie slept deeply, recovering from the ordeal of childbirth, Gideon sat in the main room holding his son. He rocked Henry gently, singing softly, watching the baby's face in the lamplight. He thought about his own father, who had been a good man but stern and distant. Gideon vowed to be different. He would be present for his children. He would tell them he loved them every day. "You're going to have a good life," he whispered to Henry. "Your mama and I are going to make sure of it." The first months of Henry's life were exhausting but joyful. Natalie recovered well from the birth, and she took to motherhood with a fierce devotion. She nursed Henry, sang to him, and spent hours just watching him sleep. Gideon helped whenever he could, changing diapers and walking Henry around when he was fussy, so Natalie could rest. The ranch thrived as well. With Gideon's hard work and smart management, the cattle herd grew. He hired a couple of ranch hands to help during busy times, young men who were respectful and hardworking. The house began to feel small with a family of 3, so Gideon started planning an addition. "We need more bedrooms," he said one evening, showing Natalie his sketches. "For Henry and for any other children we might have." "More children," Natalie asked, raising an eyebrow. She was nursing Henry, who was now 3 months old and thriving. "If you want them," Gideon said. "I know it's hard work having babies, but I'd love to have more children with you when you're ready." "I'd like that too," Natalie said softly. "I want Henry to have siblings. I want a big, happy family." "Then that's what we'll have," Gideon said, kissing her forehead. True to his word, Gideon spent the next year building an addition to the house. With help from Tom Miller and the ranch hands, he added 2 bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The house was no longer small and simple. It was a real family home, solid and spacious. Henry grew quickly, a happy baby who laughed easily and loved being outside. By the time he was a year old, he was walking and getting into everything. Natalie spent her days chasing after him, delighting in his discoveries and his joy. In the summer of 1883, Natalie found herself pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was easier. Gideon was still protective but less frantic, trusting that Natalie knew her own body and limits. Their second child, a daughter they named Emma, was born in February of 1884. She had Natalie's reddish-brown hair and Gideon's gray eyes, and she was perfect. Henry, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. "Gentle," Natalie would remind him as he patted Emma's head with his chubby toddler hands. "She's very small." "Baby," Henry would say proudly, as if he had personally created this marvelous creature. Life on the ranch fell into a happy rhythm. The children grew, the cattle multiplied, and the ranch became more prosperous. Gideon proved to be as good a father as he had promised, patient and loving and present. He taught Henry to ride a horse, to care for animals, to work hard but also to play. He cradled Emma when she cried and made her giggle with funny faces. Natalie watched her husband with their children and fell even more in love with him. He was everything her own father had not been, and she was grateful every day for the turn her life had taken. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Gideon surprised Natalie with a gift. It was a deed to the ranch with both their names on it. "It's not just my ranch anymore," he said as Natalie stared at the paper with tears in her eyes. "It's ours. Everything I have is yours. I wanted it to be official." "Gideon," Natalie whispered, overcome. "This is too much." "It's not enough," Gideon said, taking her hands. "You've given me everything, Natalie. A home, a family, a reason to wake up smiling every morning. You saved me as much as I saved you. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." Natalie pulled him into a kiss, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. Their children were napping, the house was quiet, and for a moment it was just the two of them, the cowboy and the woman he had saved, choosing each other again and again. Over the years that followed, their family continued to grow. A 3rd child arrived, another son they named Samuel, then a 4th, a daughter named Grace. The house rang with the sound of children's laughter and the organized chaos of a large family. Henry grew into a responsible boy who loved helping his father with the ranch work. Emma was spirited and fearless, always climbing trees and exploring. Samuel was gentle and thoughtful, with a gift for gentling horses. Grace was the baby, spoiled by her older siblings and adored by everyone. Natalie and Gideon watched their children grow with pride and wonder. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the area. They built a new barn, expanded the herd, and purchased more land. But no matter how successful they became, they never forgot where they had started. Every year on the anniversary of the day they met, Gideon and Natalie would sit on the porch together after the children were asleep and remember. They remembered the fear and desperation of that day in Porter's saloon. They remembered the sound of a deal being torn in half. They remembered the long ride to the ranch and the beginning of their life together. "You ever regret it?" Natalie asked one such evening. They were older now, lines of laughter and hard work etched into their faces, but the love between them had only deepened. "Taking me in." Everything that came after, Gideon looked at her like she was crazy. "Regret the best decision I ever made, not for a single second. You." "Never," Natalie said firmly. She leaned against his shoulder, fitting perfectly against his side like she always had. "You gave me a life I never dreamed possible. You gave me love and safety and family. How could I regret any of it?" "We gave those things to each other," Gideon corrected gently. "I was just a lonely cowboy with a dream before you. You made it all real." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out over the prairie. The land that had once seemed so vast and lonely now felt like home, full of life and promise. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, safe and loved. Henry, now 15, was already taller than his mother and showing signs of becoming a fine rancher. Emma, 13, was learning to cook and sew but still spent as much time outside as her mother would allow. Samuel, 10, had a natural way with animals that amazed everyone. And Grace, just 7, was learning to read and write, bright and curious about everything. This was the family that had started with a torn deal and a cowboy's compassion. This was the life that had grown from a moment of courage in a dusty saloon. This was the happily ever after that both Gideon and Natalie had fought for and built together. "I love you," Natalie said softly, the words she said every day but never grew tired of. "I love you too," Gideon replied, kissing the top of her head. "Always have, always will." As the years continued to pass, Gideon and Natalie grew old together, their love never diminishing. They saw their children grow up and start families of their own. Henry took over most of the ranch operations, proving to be as capable as his father. Emma married a kind schoolteacher and moved to a nearby town but visited often. Samuel started his own horse training business on a portion of the ranch land. And Grace became a teacher herself, educating the children of Tulsa and the surrounding area. Gideon and Natalie became grandparents and then great-grandparents, and their house was always full of family. They told their grandchildren the story of how they met, how a cowboy tore up a terrible deal and took a woman home to save her. The children listened with wide eyes, thinking it was the most romantic story they had ever heard. "Did you know right away that you loved Grandma?" one grandchild asked Gideon one day. Gideon considered the question, his aged but still bright gray eyes finding Natalie across the room where she was holding a great-grandchild. "I knew right away that she was important," he said. "That she deserved better than what was happening to her." The love came after, but it came strong and it never left. Natalie smiled at him, and in that smile was the memory of everything they had shared. The fear and the hope, the struggles and the triumphs, the quiet moments and the joyful ones. They had built a life together that had started in darkness, but had become filled with light. When Gideon passed away at the age of 76, surrounded by his family, his last words were to Natalie. "Thank you for saying yes," he whispered, holding her hand with what little strength he had left. "Thank you for choosing me." "Thank you for saving me," Natalie replied through her tears. "Thank you for loving me. I'll see you again, my love." He smiled and closed his eyes and slipped away peacefully. Natalie grieved deeply for her husband, the man who had given her everything. But she did not despair. She was surrounded by the family they had created, by the life they had built. She lived for 3 more years, spending time with her children and grandchildren, tending the garden Gideon had helped her plant so many years ago and keeping his memory alive. When Natalie passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 73, She was laid to rest beside Gideon on a hillside overlooking the ranch. Their matching headstones read simply, Gideon Stone, beloved husband, father, and grandfather Natalie Stone, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother together forever. The ranch continued to thrive under Henry's care, and the Stone family became a fixture in Oklahoma, known for their hard work, their integrity, and their devotion to each other. And whenever the family gathered, someone would inevitably tell the story of how it all began, with a terrible deal, a torn piece of paper, and a cowboy who chose compassion over convenience. It was a love story that began with an act of courage and grew into a legacy that lasted for generations. It was proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments, that love can bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that a single decision to do the right thing can change everything. Gideon Stone had walked into Porter's saloon looking for nothing more than a drink before heading home. He left with a woman who needed saving and found a love that would define his entire life. Natalie Richmond had been traded for a bottle and a handshake, treated as less than human by the man who should have protected her. But she found a man who saw her worth, who gave her freedom and love and a family. Their story was told and retold, passed down through the generations as a reminder of what true love looks like, selfless, brave, and enduring. It was a story of the Wild West, of hard times and harder choices, of a moment that changed two lives forever. And it was a story with the ending both Gideon and Natalie deserved, a long, happy life together, filled with love and family and joy. They had started with nothing but hope in each other, and they had built an empire of love that would last long after they were gone. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not the ranch, not the money, not the success. Just the love between two people who had found each other against all odds and had chosen, every single day, to build something beautiful together. It was the kind of love story that deserved to be remembered, the kind that restored faith in humanity, the kind that proved that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope. Because sometimes, when you least expect it, a cowboy walks into a saloon and tears up a terrible deal and takes you home. And that one act of kindness can become the foundation of a love that lasts forever.